Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned with the Robert E. Howard Show. It's the Robert E. Howard Show once again, where Roger and I are here to talk about character development. Yes, character development. That obsession of modern fiction where every character has to have an arc. Gotta have an arc. Gotta have an arc for your characters, Roger. Oh my goodness. Gotta have one of those. And one of the criticisms I sometimes hear leveled against Robert E. Howard's writing is that there's no character development. No, the characters start off awesome and they end up awesome by the end of the story. Can't have that. Actually, there is quite a bit of character development in Robert E. Howard's stories, at least his major series. Although it can be hard to see if you're just reading a story here and a story there. We have to remember that these stories were written predominantly for the pulps. And they could be 50 or 60 pages long. And they were full of action, and you had to have a plot. These are pulp stories, so they are plot driven. You had to have a character show up, action all the way through usually, has to take care of business. This character has to do a bunch of stuff. And it's not all about the character developing in that 40 or 50 or 60 pages. There's just not room for it. However, Robert E. Howard is able to pull it off. He actually had a lot of skill as a writer. And when he writes his stories, it doesn't take him a lot of space in the story to present you with realistic characters. He gives you some characters that you can believe in a very short amount of space. That's all he had to work with. And so you don't always see the development of these characters until you step back and look at the series as a whole, whatever that series might be. Now, it depends on the series that he's writing about. If it's just a slam bang action adventure series that just doesn't take a breath the whole way through, as certain series were, the more action-oriented ones, then you're not going to have a lot of room for character development, But in others, you saw the characters develop quite a bit over the space of those stories. Not always. If we take, for an example, Kull. Let's take a look at Kull. A lot of the development in Kull's character took place before we ever meet him. Kull had a very interesting backstory. Most of it we never see. We saw a little bit when Kull was still a savage on Atlantis. Atlantis in these stories by Robert E. Howard is a very primitive, barbaric place where Kull comes from. And we get a little bit of Kull's backstory in the beginning of this book, for example. But then we jump ahead in time to when he is king, and we just hear about his backstory here and there. He's already king. He's already set on the throne, and he has a series of adventures while he's already king. A lot of his character development has already happened. It's not entirely finished, though, and you do see him change a little here and there over the course of the stories. You see a pretty major change in the first story, the Shadow Kingdom, when he first meets Brule, the Spear Slayer, who is a character he should not get along with at all because he's a Pict. And Kull's tribe in Atlantis and the Picts, they were hereditary enemies. These guys shouldn't like each other, and in fact, when they first meet each other, they don't like each other. But over the course of the story, Kull learns to trust this guy, and by the end of the story, Brule the Spear Slayer and Kull are good friends, and they remain good friends for the rest of the series. This is not a long series. The only other major development in Kull's character probably happens in By This Axe I Rule, where Kull destroys a set of laws that he just didn't like and declares, "By this axe I rule. I am the law." So the big character development in that story is that Kull becomes more of an authoritarian ruler, Yay. So there's that. But otherwise, Kull's character is pretty much set. But he's such an interesting guy, it really doesn't matter because he's a very interesting character. And he's a character that the more you learn about him, the little chance that you have, the more interesting he becomes. And again, Robert E. Howard was writing short stories, a series of short stories, which were very plot heavy. So you didn't have much of a chance with Kull to develop his character as much as, say, you would get in characters in modern novels, for example. But then you have a character, one of my favorite characters, like Solomon Kane, Robert E. Howard's Solomon Kane, the English Puritan who's obsessed with righting wrongs. Solomon Kane believes that he has been chosen by God to be God's avenger on earth, basically. He will wander the earth righting wrongs. If he sees something dastardly has happened, if he sees an injustice, he will do whatever he has to do to right that wrong, even if it takes him years to do it. And occasionally, that's something that will happen. He's obsessed. A very religious, obsessed character, Solomon Kane. Interesting character. Probably the most interesting character I think Robert E. Howard ever wrote, and that's one of the reasons he's one of my favorites. And definitely in the Kane series, you do see him change over time. There's definite character development that you can see. Now, this series is different than the Conan series because this series takes place pretty much in chronological order. The Conan series jumped around to different adventures in Conan's life at different times. This, we're following along with Kane. There are pretty big breaks here and there, but otherwise we're following along. As he has adventures in different parts of the world, eventually ends up in Africa, where he spends an awful lot of time. And if you just read single adventures, you don't see it as much. But if you read this whole book from beginning to end, you definitely see the development in Solomon Kane's character. Although it is true, and this is one of the things that's interesting about this character, he never really learns about himself. He never figures out who he really is. He never discovers his own motivations as they really are. He thinks he's motivated by a pure sense of duty. He really believes that he's been put on earth by God to right wrongs. That is his motivation. Whereas Robert E. Howard makes it clear that really a big part of why he does what he does is because he just likes the adventure. He's got a wandering foot. He's got wanderlust. He's always seeking the next adventure. He always has to have a life of action. And he loves that, but he doesn't admit that to himself. He doesn't understand that that's why he's doing what he's doing. And he never discovers that, although you get the sense that he's trying as he goes along in the adventures in this book. But he never really stumbles on that. He's always a mystery to himself. But as he goes along, particularly when he's in Africa, he finds himself in a position where he meets, for example, a wizard who, being such an ungodly character this wizard could bring people back from the dead and do all kinds of things. Solomon Kane should not want anything to do with this character, but they end up friends. And he has an attraction to the country. He's fascinated by Africa. And so he just stays there for a long time, traveling through Africa. And I get the sense that what he's actually searching for are answers to his own motivations. He's searching for himself in a way, something he never finds. But he finds lots of action, and his mission is always predominant in his mind. He always will right wrongs when he sees them. And, you know, he has a bunch of great supernatural adventures. One adventure in particular is particularly fascinating for this character, which is a story called Wings in the Night. Wings in the Night, which I've talked a lot about in the past. Did a video on this particular story. This is a story where he has a mission. He runs across an African native who's been horribly tortured, and he's dying, and just horribly tortured. I mean, a great wrong has happened. And so when Solomon Kane sees this poor guy and sees what's been done to him, he vows that he will get justice for this native who's dying from the torture he has undergone. Who's ever done this ghastly thing will pay, he vows. And as we know from earlier in this book, if he vows a thing like that, he's going to carry it through to the end. And he does, but the end of this story is particularly tragic. Because it doesn't end up being as clear-cut as Kane believes it will be. And even he, a character that sees things in black and white, has to admit there are shades of gray here. And we have a great supernatural menace that he has to battle to protect a village, and he fails. This is a story where Solomon Kane fails spectacularly in epic fashion, and the only thing left by the end of this story is for him to get revenge. And it's fascinating to see this character driven to his absolute limits and having to face the consequences of his failure. His mission in this particular adventure anyway, he's failed his mission. And all he can get is revenge. That's all he can get. And then he continues on with further adventures. And it's a fascinating look at how this guy's attitudes are changing without him even realizing it, basically. He's accepting things that he never would have accepted when he started off in the beginning of the story. Or his stories, I should say. It's really an interesting series of stories when you look at it like that. And they're tremendously fun. They're awesome. Solomon Kane, great, great character. And definitely character development in this series. As there's definitely character development in Conan. Robert E. Howard's greatest creation, certainly in my mind, his greatest series of stories. It's harder to see in Conan because these stories bounce around so much. You know, you could have a story starting off when he's already king of Aquilonia, then you'll have a story where he's a thief, then it jumps to another story at another point in his life. And so it's not going to be as easy to see as you see it in the Solomon Kane volume, but definitely this is a character who changes over time. Again, in a 50 or 60 page adventure that's very plot driven, and you have a character that just has to take care of business, it could be harder to see. But if you step back and look at the stories as a whole, you certainly see the developments in Conan's character, particularly after he gains responsibility. He gets more and more responsibility over time, whether he is the leader of pirates, you know, or whether he's the commander of an army. As soon as he has people under him, whether, you know, it's an outlaw band or whatever, the sense of responsibility changes Conan's personality. The more responsibility he gets, the more he changes. And this reaches its ultimate point probably in The Hour of the Dragon, the one novel that Robert E. Howard wrote about Conan, although that's a very episodic novel. It's a lot of fun. But in that, we see a character who probably would have a better time if he were not king. You get the distinct sense that the responsibility of being a king weighs very heavily on Conan, who for most of his life was just the ultimate free character. He went wherever he wanted. He did whatever he wanted, you know? And here he is with responsibilities, and he's no longer in that position that he was in earlier in his life. Now, he's got a whole kingdom to protect. He's got subjects. and they are under a lot of they're in a lot of danger in the Hour of the Dragon. And Conan in that book has to fight for his kingdom. So basically he's fighting for something that in a way he doesn't even want, because he probably would be happier without all that responsibility. But nevertheless, he does feel that responsibility, and he's not going to let his subjects suffer if he can help it. Conan, an interesting character. He could be ruthless, he could be savage, but at heart, he's a decent guy, basically. And particularly when it comes to innocent people, like his subjects, yeah, he's going to help them out if he can. He's going to accept the responsibility that he's taken. A responsibility that when he took the crown of Aquilonia, he didn't really consider the consequences. Nevertheless, he accepts the responsibility. And we have a very different Conan in the last adventures that he has than young Conan when he was a thief. And when he was new to civilization. It's interesting when you look at the series as a whole, just how Conan did change over time. And again, it could be harder to see because the way Robert E. Howard wrote it, and the best way to read it, frankly, is, the series of adventures that skip all over the place in Conan's life. And when you step back, you can see the whole of his adventures. And then you see how his character did develop and change over time. He had an arc, Roger. That's what he had. It's interesting. You always find new things when you read Robert E. Howard. It's great stuff. I will shut up now, Roger. I think I've proven my point. I will catch you next time.